Hi, and welcome to my forward bending map. This is a workshop style online class. I'm going to go over some of the common mistakes or common patterns I see from students that are not progressing within their forward bend, and some of the ways in which you can address those patterns. Feel free to pause this at any point. It's not really a practice, so it's not going to be a flowing sort of thing. More information-based things that you can reference whenever you need to, and hopefully you'll find some value in it that you can implement in some of the other practices that you are doing. So one of the things that I always discuss in regards to forward bending that I think is important to understand is that if you're not progressing within your forward bend, most likely you're not forward bending. You're not giving your body the right type of stimulus for your body to make an adaptation. So this is a basic principle of exercise physiology. The SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demands. So we adapt to the things that we demand of our body. And so some of these common patterns that I'll discuss are taking you away from actually making any progress or giving your body the right type of stimulus for the body to make a change in terms of your range of motion or your capacities within that range of motion. So the common patterns that I see within forward bending, the biomechanics of forward bending, number one would be excessive pelvic tilt. So either excessively in posterior pelvic tilt or excessively in anterior pelvic tilt. You may see this as a student or as a teacher stuck in this position where the pelvis is stuck in posterior pelvic tilt, and therefore I can't actually change the hip flexion angle here. So I'm sort of just moving my chest down towards the legs. Also, in terms of forward bending, really common to see in the yoga world, excessive anterior pelvic tilt, where I'm putting my spine into extension in the forward bend. It's not necessarily that is bad per se, but typically forward bending is back line release, front line contractions, and by putting your pelvis into anterior pelvic tilt, you may get a little bit more hamstring work, but in terms of the spinal trunk work, you're working the other side of the body, which again, if that's something you want to do, that's fine. One of the other common patterns that I'll see is that the spine is flexing prematurely. So this would play out more in terms of a standing forward fold where I'm going to flex my spine right away and fold. This is a common way to get out of hamstring work. So if your hamstrings are chronically tense, quite typical when you flex your spine first, we're not even going to feel the hamstrings very much. Because again, we're sort of getting out of the hip flexing part of the movement. And then one more is sort of a subtle one. It's what I would describe as just excessive tension within the movement. And I see it quite typically with moving the knees back and moving the hips back excessively, and creating a lot of sort of what I call global tension in the body. So there should be local tension. The tension should again be specific to whatever it is that you're doing with your with any type of training. So again, if we're doing forward bending, we should feel some hamstring stretch release. We should feel some front line work, some hip flexor work. some front line trunk work. We should feel back line stretch and release. Those are all sort of normal, expected sensory sort of output that we should get. But if your whole body is under tension, if you feel sort of globalized tension in the movement, I think you're working against your nervous system and you're not actually going to be able to progress. So again, sort of with forward bending, I see a lot of sort of moving the knees back, moving the hips back, and then folding in a really tense way. So I'm going to tell you to bend your knees. Again, this isn't the end all be all of how to do the forward bend. It's just my opinion that we should do the forward bend with as little tension as possible in the body, especially when we're folding from a standing position. If you were going to, in your everyday life, fold down or sort of reach down to pick something up from the ground, you wouldn't sort of go like that, swan dive down, pick it up, and sort of swan dive back up. You would bend your knees, you'd relax, you'd do it gently, come back up. I think that there is a real benefit to doing things with as little tension as possible, especially as little global tension in terms of our nervous system when we're moving. So we'll go over how to address all of those biomechanics, and then I'll show you a routine that I would do to release the hip flexors, and then start to work on the the hamstrings, the backline muscles, releasing the backline muscles, and hopefully improving your forward bend. So let's get to it. First, we're going to come to a standing position and talk about the biomechanic of forward folding from a standing position. So again, I think that this is one where we can sort of notice certain patterns and maybe a lack of firing of specific muscles, and maybe some overall global tension in the movement. So what I have students do first and foremost, because I think, again, when we look at this movement, this biomechanic, we tend to think of it as the spine moving towards the hips. And I think of it as the hips moving towards the spine, or should I say the legs moving towards the spine. So it's hip flexion first. So this is the actual movement of the leg coming up to the spine and back down. And so while I'm doing this, my spine can be relatively neutral. So I think that this is the important sort of initial muscle firing, the thing that we want to have happen first in terms of the chain of events for this biomechanic. So we want to sort of get the hip flexor to turn on. Maybe you want to do that with the other leg, just to sort of feel these muscles fire. And so when we're doing the actual biomechanic from a standing position, those muscles are going to be, they're not actually sort of moving towards the spine. The spine is moving towards the legs, but we want to learn how to recruit those muscles. So I'm going to have you start on the wall. So find a wall and have your feet about 2 to 3 inches away from the wall, and depending sort of how much you're going to need in terms of space backwards. But one reason I use the wall is because I don't want you to go back excessively from this position. The other reason is I want you to think about sort of the midline of the body. So I'm going to, again, tell you to bend your knees and practice with bending your knees. And so we're going to find the wall, from being about 2 inches away from the wall. You're going to find the wall with your knees bent. So we'll see if you were to sort of draw a line from the heel up to the spine. You'll notice that the knees are forward of that line, the hips are behind the line. About midway up the spine, my chest is going to be forward of the line. My lower back will be slightly behind the line. So it's a slightly angled position, similar to a small chair pose in yoga. If you've ever, if you're a yoga practitioner, Utkatasana position. And so what I want to do first is learn how to fire these hip flexors. So again, think of this as sort of like moving the leg up to the spine, but we're not actually going to do that, so it's got to be an isometric contraction. So what I'm going to do is create a resistance between my hands and my quads. So I'm going to push down onto my the fronts of my legs, and the legs are going to push up into the hands. And so try to really push the legs up isometrically into the hands. Obviously, you can't leave the ground from this position, but you will also feel that your legs start to really fire up from here, and that your front line muscles should sort of start to pull in and fire up. So try this for a breath or two. It's fun. Oh yeah. And then relax. So first thing that we're going to try to do here is just sort of move through this position while firing those muscles. And what I want you to focus on as well is keeping your knees forward of your heels. So you may notice that your knees want to come back to the wall, and try to keep your knees forward of the heels. I also think this, in terms of counterbalance, is a much easier way to utilize your ankles and utilize your feet in this position, which I think is a very important thing for forward bending, because if we're not utilizing the lower half of our body, our spine needs to be more tense. So by utilizing the leg strength and creating strength in the legs, the spine can be more relaxed throughout this movement. So again, here you're going to find the wall, and you may have to move your feet further away from the wall, but shift your knees forward, have your hips on the wall, start to push down into the legs, creating this tension. You're going to now bring your spine to the hips. Bring your spine to the hips. Keep pushing into the legs. Keep pulling the legs up. Keep your knees forward. Sort of tricky to do. Wherever you get to in this position, keep the tension between the hands and the legs. We're trying to recruit the hip flexors throughout this position, and then you can come back. Let's try this 2 more times. So again, pushing down into the fronts of the legs. Find the wall, knees stay forward, 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 push down, push down, push down, push down, push down, and relax. 1 more time. Again, from this position, pushing down into the fronts of the legs, getting the legs to fire up, keeping the spine as relaxed as you can, but closing the hip angle. So you'll see, again, what the forward bend is hip flexion first. So we're closing the hip angle and then coming back up, and relax for just a moment here. And so that would be number 1. Number 2, we're going to then look at pelvic tilt here and spinal traction. So as I said before, excessive pelvic tilt in one direction or the other. So I can be in a really big back bend here. I can be in a excessive spinal flexion here coming down, and posterior pelvic tilt. What I'm looking for is a relatively neutral pelvic position and spinal traction. So I want to just get my spine to be nice and long and extended through the vertical axis of the spine while recruiting my legs. So here again, we're going to bring the hands onto the knees. A couple of times I'm just going to move the pelvis into posterior pelvic tilt and anterior pelvic tilt. So I like to cue this by moving the waistband. So you're going to pull the waistband up and then pull the waistband down. Pull the waistband up, pull the waistband down. And then find sort of the middle of that movement, the neutrality, and then think about lengthening your rib cage away from your hips and then lengthening the crown of the head away from the hips. And again, we're going to do this position, recruiting the hip flexors, pushing the hands into the legs, pushing the legs up into the hands, keeping the knees forward. Try to keep your spine tracking the whole time, tracking the whole time, tracking the whole time. And then coming back up. So do this 2 more times. Finding your neutral pelvis. If you need to, rock the pelvis in both directions. And then traction the spine. Recruit the hip flexors, recruit the hip flexors, recruit the hip flexors. Push into the hands, or push into the legs, push into the legs, push into the legs. And come back up. And one more time. Neutral spine. Traction the spine. Push the hands into the legs, push the hands into the legs, push the hands into the legs, push the hands into the legs. And then coming back up. Relax for a moment, shake it out if you need to. Okay. And then one last thing here, the thoracic spine. So again, what's really common is to see the upper spine and the head flex down. I think sometimes it is a lack of awareness that that this is happening, but it appears that we're going deeper into a forward bend because I'm bringing my my spine closer to the legs, when in actuality a lot of times it's keeping us away from the hamstring work. So the way that I correct this position is to use my hands behind the back of the head. So again, here we're in neutral pelvis, neutral pelvic tilt, tracking the spine. Now I'm going to bring my hands behind the back of the head and bring the head back, chin back here, without extending the neck or flexing the neck. So I'm going to bring the head back, chin back, so keeping the chin facing down. Keep the rib cage in just a little bit. See if you can get a bit more traction. And then we're going to really recruit the legs, recruit the legs. I'm going to have to slide forward a little bit more. Recruit the legs, 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 recruit the legs. And then coming back up. Again here. Find traction, head against the hands. Rib cage pulls down. Nice neutral spine tracking. Recruit the legs, 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 recruit the legs. Coming back up one more time. Head against the hands. Ribs in. Traction the spine. Recruit the legs, recruit the legs, recruit the legs, recruit the legs. And then coming back up and relax. Okay, so we've got, again, those prompts to find a neutral pelvic tilt, traction the spine, traction the neck and the upper spine, keeping that from flexing too early, and then recruiting the hip flexors. One more muscle group that we're going to recruit is our lateral bends. So we're going to recruit the abductor and adductors in the legs. So what I want you to do again here is come to the wall, and then you're going to isometrically try to pull your feet out away from each other. And what you'll feel is that there's an inner hug in the legs as well. So again, you can bring your hands to the back of the head, traction the spine, and then try to isometrically pull the floor apart while you do this. And then coming back up. Maybe you want to do this with your arms now straight. So you're going to pull the feet apart, reach forward, reach forward, reach forward. I'm going to have to get a little bit further off. Reach forward, reach forward, reach forward, reach forward. Pull the floor apart, pull the floor apart, pull the floor apart, and relax. One more time. Isometrically squeezing the floor apart, recruiting the hip flexors, tractioning the spine here, and we'll come down, come down, come down, come down, come down, come down. And what you'll see at the end here is that I can now, with my knees bent and knees in front of the heels, I can start to lift my hips away from the wall, keeping the hip flexion. Now I'm going to go even deeper into the hamstring stretch. So you want to stay forward with the forward bend. The wall gives you a little bit of reference point, so we can really traction the spine forward, and then you can start to move the hips away from the wall at the end, and even flex your spine, bring the chest to the legs. But number one, we want to close the space between the spine and the quad. So maximize hip flexion first while keeping the legs engaged, and then at the end of it, we'll come into the hamstring stretch. So I'll do this away from the wall here. Again, with the knees forward, bend in the knees. So if you were doing this in like the sun salutations, you do it this way. At least this is the way that I would teach it. Pulling the floor apart, recruiting the quads as I fold down, come forward, come forward. Now I'm in the hip fold, and then I'll move my hips forward and out. Release the head down. You can try that a couple of times. Knees forward. I'm going to come forward, come forward, come forward, come forward, tracking the spine, tracking the spine, tracking the spine, tracking the spine. At the end, hips are closed. They'll bring the hips up, and I'm in the hamstring stretch. So that would be the biomechanic of moving from standing down to the forward fold. Something that I think will integrate nicely into something like a sun salutation if you're practicing yoga. And then now let's go into some of the other mechanics of the hip. So one way to strengthen your active hip flexor would be to try to close the gap between your active range of motion and your passive range of motion. So active range of motion would be, let's start with passive range of motion. Your passive range of motion would be the range of motion that you could achieve while moving your joints passively into a certain position. So from here, again, I'm moving my hip into hip flexion. The floor is stabilizing my spine. So this is just pure hip flexion here, whatever this is. And now if I was to do this in a weight-bearing situation, what's quite common is that the leg would have to sort of fall back to maybe here. So this difference between bringing the leg here, bringing the leg here, is what I want to now make strong and active. I want to learn how to sort of control that range of motion. So the best exercise I have for this is in a balancing position. You can do it using a wall because the balance isn't the priority of this exercise. I'm just going to face this way though to show you. So here I'm going to now pull the leg up, and the goal is to then control this position. It's really, really challenging to my strength to keep the leg up. So right now my hand is resting on the knee and the leg is pulling up into the hip flexor. I'm gonna work this for 20 seconds. Lift up, lift up, lift up, lift up, and relax. And then we'll do it on the other side. And if you wanna really work on this, I would do this 3 to 5 sets with about a minute rest in between. So again, here I'm gonna pull up as high as I can and then try to control this for 20 to 30 seconds. Lift up, 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 and relax. Okay, so the other one is then with the straight leg. So I like to first break this apart. So what we're looking at here is I'm going to be in a seated position with my spine as upright as possible. So we're not allowing the spine to shorten or for the weight of the body to lean back into the hands. Try to find a position where you can maintain the spine upright and the weight out of the hands. The hands will just sort of be here for balance, but try to notice if you're leaning excessively into the hands or the spine is shortening. So we're going to keep this really tall. And then I want you to notice the angle of your hip. So you can move the angle of the hip further out. So this would be less than 90 degrees because my spine is leaning back a little bit. This would be close to about 90 degrees. This would be a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. So the goal is now to find the position where you can keep the hip angle and straighten the knee, keeping the spine as well. So find the position where you can keep the weight out of the hands, straighten the knee, and back. So that might be here. That might be even further out. Find that position. And again, we'll do about 5 of these lift-offs. Straightening the knee, back. Straighten the knee, back. So I would do this as well, 3 to 5 sets. You can, and slowly try to get more and more of this. Eventually, doing this with the spine as upright as possible, weight out of the hands, doing this more and more actively. So this is a way to, again, sort of address the standing balancing position, and then, or I should say, to address the hip flexion with the knee bent, and then to address the quad and the hamstring separately in trying to make both of those ranges of motion active. Okay, so one more sequence that I think is a really great way to start to address this is to first release your hip flexors. So what's quite often times, again, sort of the hip flexor is shortened, and that's what's pulling the front line of our body down and forcing us to prematurely flex our upper spine. So what we want to do first is to release the hip flexors while keeping the spine tall and upright. And so in order to do this, we're going to maintain posterior pelvic tilt. I'll have you tilt your pelvis so that your front waistband area is pulling up towards the navel, spine is nice and tall, and a couple of times we're going to go into hip extension to release the back leg hip flexor. So we're going to do this 5 times. Come forward, and then back, coming forward, and back, coming forward, and back, coming forward, and holding here. So again, try to posterior pelvic tilt, draw the front waistband up, spine really tall here. You're going to turn slowly and turn slowly. It's a great way to release the hip flexor. 5 times we're going to rotate the spine with hip extension, posterior pelvic tilt. 3. One more time, nice and tall. And relax. So from here now, we're going to actually stretch the opposite leg because we were releasing this hip flexor. So I'm going to change sides now and bring the blocks now around the right leg. So think about here of keeping your hips relatively square, and then all of these movements that we just did before. So imagine your hips against the wall and your pelvis neutral. We're going to track the spine in the angle of the pelvis. We want to keep the hand against the head, or at least if you need help balancing, think about what we just did with the hand against the head. We're going to fold forward. Come to about 80% of your forward fold, and then you're going to come up halfway. Same thing now. You're going to traction the spine and fold forward again. And we'll come up again about 80%, about halfway. Again, traction the spine and fold again. Come up again. Traction the spine. Fold again. One more time. We'll traction the spine and fold. And then come back up. So the idea here with this movement now is that I'm going to try to make my nervous system calm in this movement. So by only going about halfway and not lingering for very long, I sort of describe this as like cold water swimming. The first time you cold water swim, when you jump into the water, it's quite shocking to your system. Your system immediately sort of clamps up and starts to give you this stress, fight or flight ramp up of your system. And so what we want to do before we make a long-term change is start to normalize this position for the body so that we can go in and out of it calmly and then do more and more specific work. So I think that this is a really important first step in making progress, especially if it's a very tense position. So now we're going to do the other side. So starting with the right leg forward, I'm going to be in posterior pelvic tilt. Nice and tall with the spine. I'm going to come forward into hip extension and then right back. Coming forward into hip extension and right back. Coming forward into hip extension, right back. Coming forward into hip extension, right back. One more time, into hip extension. Pause here. Again, posterior pelvic tilt, really tall. 5 times, slow and controlled. I'm going to rotate in this position and mash up my hip flexor. Last one. And then release. Again, we're switching legs. So this time I'll do the left leg with the forward fold. Think about drawing your left hip back and keeping your hips square, nice and tall. I'll give you just a different perspective here. So use your hands if you need balance. Again, we're trying to keep our nervous system as calm as possible. But if you have balance, you can bring the hand behind the head and the opposite hand on the hip. So again, here I'm going to fold about 80% and then come up halfway, traction the spine, and then fold again. Come up about halfway, traction the spine, fold again, come up about halfway, traction the spine, and then fold again. One more time, come up halfway, traction the spine, and then come out nice and relaxed. All right, so again, I think I would say undervalued practice to do is to just familiarize your system with whatever it is that you want it to change. Because oftentimes the system, our nervous system, is quite resistant to change, especially if a certain area of the body is excessively tense. If there's global tension whenever you go there, we want to first sort of address that before we go into any long-term permanent change. So I hope this was useful for you. Feel free to email me with any questions. Thank you so much.